Our brains can remember a ton of stuff. We can recite the lyrics to our favorite songs years after we learned them. Celebrity gossip and memes live rent-free in our heads, not to mention the stuff we take for granted, like recognizing tens of thousands of words without issue. If we treat our brains as computers, they can hold 55 million ebooks worth of information, which is wild. But what if we could replace our squishy human brains with something else? Say a bunch of hard drives or the latest cutting-edge data storage technology. Could we cram even more info in our heads? And if so, is there a limit to how much we can pack in there? As a baseline, let's re-examine how much info our brains can store as is. To do this, we're going to analyze our brains as though they're computers. This isn't the most perfect approach, but it makes the math a whole lot easier. In a computer, information is stored using a fundamental unit called a binary digit, or bit for short. Each bit can be in one of two states, a 0 or a 1. As you add more bits, you can store exponentially more info. So 2 bits can store 2 squared or 4 states, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, and 1, 1. 3 bits can store 2 cubed or 8 states, 4 bits can store 2 to the 4th or 16 states, and so on and so forth. To store information, we can map different states to different numbers or letters. Originally, these individual characters were represented by a block of 8 bits. For easy bookkeeping, this 8-bit block was named a byte. Both terms have stuck around, so sometimes we quantify information in terms of bits, abbreviated with a small b, and other times we use bytes with a big B, which is a situation ripe for mistakes, but alas. Now, back to our brains. Scientists have tried to quantify how much info our brains can store by finding the brain's version of a bit, and a really good equivalent is the synapse. A synapse is the interface between two neurons, and its job is to communicate information between them. It does this by continuously transmitting chemical or electrical signals and modulating their strengths. So if we treat the different signal strengths as different information states, we can determine how many bits a synapse can store. Using a combination of neuroscience and computer information theory, scientists have estimated that a single synapse can store between 4.1 to 4.6 bits of info. On average, a human brain has 250 trillion synapses, which means our brain can hold 143 terabytes of info. If a typical ebook is 2.6 million bytes, that's about 55 million ebooks. But what if we could replace our brains with actual computer parts? How much information can we store? To start, let's try swapping out our brains with a hard disk drive or HDD, which is what many computers use to store their data. HDDs get their name because they store data on a spinning disk or platter coated with magnetic material. This platter is divided into lots of tiny sections that each represent a bit, and each section can be magnetized in one of two directions, which correspond to either a 1 or 0. To store data, a needle called a read and write head moves to a specific section and generates a magnetic field to change the bit's magnetization. Now, to estimate how much HDD storage we can cram in our brains, we need to know both their physical and data sizes. HDDs usually come in a standard metal box that's 147 millimeters by 102 millimeters by 26 millimeters. And right now, one of the highest capacity HDDs on the market is the Seagate Exos Mosaic 3 Plus, which can store 36 terabytes of data, although you've got to be a fancy data center or business to buy one. But supposing we could get our hands on those data-dense HDDs, if we packed them into the same volume as a human brain, we would be able to hold 120 terabytes of data, which is worse than what our actual brain can do. Maybe we should be replacing computers with brains. But wait, HDDs aren't just pure data storage. They also include auxiliary parts that allow us to access and edit the stored data, like the read and write head. If we throw these parts out and pack in just the platters, we won't be capable of having dynamic thoughts, but we can store around 1.2 petabytes of data, around 8 times more than our actual brains. But if you're a stickler for being able to access your data and have actual thoughts, we can look at a different form of computer data storage, the solid-state drive, or SSD. SSDs store data using a grid of electrical switches called floating gate transistors. Each transistor stores 1 bit of data by filling or emptying a reservoir, aka a gate, with electrons. A filled or charged gate turns the transistor off and represents a 0, while an empty or discharged gate turns the transistor on to represent a 1. SSDs are an alternative alternative to HDDs that promise high data storage densities, with the caveat that they also have a limit to how many times we can write to them before they stop working. In other words, it's probably not a good idea to use them inside the head of a person continually updating what they know about the world. SSDs come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, including the same standard metal box that HDDs come in. But if we're shooting for high data density, the way to go is the thin M.2 form factor commonly used in laptops. One of the most data-dense M.2s is the WD Black SN850X. This SSD can hold 8 terabytes of data in a space roughly half the size of a standard ID card. If we were to pack these into a human brain volume, we could store 1.6 petabytes of data, which is equivalent to 600 million ebooks. That's 30% more than just cramming in HDD platters. And we can still access our data. Yay for dynamic thoughts. But this episode is not brought to you by either Seagate or Western Digital, so now we have to show you an ad. Thanks to Brilliant for supporting this SciShow video. Brilliant is an interactive online learning platform that lets you move at your own pace, whether you prefer to take it slow, completing one short lesson at a time whenever it fits into your schedule, or make learning about algebra your latest hyperfixation. Brilliant accommodates all sorts of learning styles. If you're like me, you want to do more, but don't always make it over that time or effort hurdle. But with Brilliant's flexible pacing, you can accomplish something every day and turn learning into a new, healthy habit. To try Brilliant for free, visit brilliant.org/scishow, scan the QR code on screen, or click on the link in the video description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Let us not limit ourselves to typical computer storage technology. For example, we can go back to biology for inspiration and find we already have a very efficient way to store information. Our DNA. DNA stores our genetic information in a sequential ladder with different combinations of 4 nucleotide bases: adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. Each rung on the ladder has 4 possible base pair combinations, equivalent to 2 bits of information. For humans, one DNA molecule has about 3.2 billion rungs, which means it can store 800 megabytes of information, and all of that info is packed into a tiny nucleus around 10 microns in diameter. So if we were to just fill our brain space with nuclei, we could store 2 zettabytes of data. That's 2 followed by 21 zeros and equivalent to 750 trillion ebooks. We can also look at some up-and-coming computer storage technology. One example is magneto-resistive random access memory, or MRAM. Like HDDs, this tech stores data magnetically, but with a twist, or should I say a spin, because instead of one magnetic layer, MRAMs typically have 2, with an insulating layer in between. One layer of the magnetic sandwich is permanently magnetized in one direction, while the other's magnetization changes depending on the bit's state. If a certain bit needs to be a 0, the corresponding spot on that second layer is magnetized in the opposite direction relative to the first. If it needs to be a 1, it's magnetized in the same direction. And to swap a bit from 0 to 1, or vice versa, MRAMs manipulate the direction that the layer's electrons are spinning through electric currents. By controlling the magnetization of these bits using currents instead of magnetic fields, MRAMs avoid a lot of the technological limitations that HDDs have, which opens the door for high data densities. MRAMs are still mostly in the R&D phase, but there's lots of promise. Recently, researchers at Kioxia built an MRAM prototype that can store 64 gigabits with an area smaller than the smallest grains of sand. If we could fill our brains with this cutting-edge stuff, we'd store 1.6 yottabytes of data, or 1.6 trillion bytes. That's not only about 1,000 times more ebooks than our DNA storage system, it's almost 9 times the amount of data that the entire world will generate in 2025. But we may be able to do even better than that. Say by mapping bits not onto microscopic switches or teeny tiny sections of a magnetized disk, but onto single atoms. There are a bunch of ways to do this, but let's look at one method done by scientists at the University of Alberta in 2018. They used hydrogen atoms to represent bits placed on top of a thin piece of silicon. If an atom is in a certain spot, that's a 1. If it isn't there, it's a 0. With this method, the team was able to achieve a high data density density around 47 times higher than our example SSD from earlier. So if we were to stuff our brains with this hydrogen atom tech, we could store 75 petabytes of data. In other words, about 30 billion of those ebooks, which is kind of a letdown after the other numbers we've thrown around, but that's because this tech requires auxiliary parts to work, including that bed of silicon atoms for the hydrogens to sit on. To get numbers that are more fun, let's pretend we could perfectly map 1 bit to 1 atom without any additional overhead. And to really push the limits, let's use the atom with the smallest radius, helium. If we replaced our brains with helium atoms, ignoring any weird laws of physics getting them that close together, we could store around 1 million zettabytes in our head. That's 5,500 times more than the expected amount of globally generated data in 2025. And we can keep playing this game and think about storing data in subatomic particles like protons or electrons, or even weirder stuff like quarks. But instead of going down that particular rabbit hole, let's dive into another hole. A black hole. Black holes are the upper limit of how much info we can pack into a given space. In other words, if we were to keep packing more and more info into our heads, eventually our heads would collapse into a black hole. To which I say, no thank you. But if we could somehow live through that, we can actually calculate how much info our black hole brain could store thanks to Jacob Bekenstein and Stephen Hawking. Through a combination of their work, we know the information density of a black hole, which stores its information not within its 3D insides, but just its 2D surface. Yes, that is weird. No, we don't have time to get into how that works, but it's got something to do with gravity. If we use their math and treat our black hole brain as a sphere with the same volume as a human brain, we can estimate that this black hole brain can store around 10 to the 55 terabytes of info. That's 10 million trillion terabytes. If we were to maintain our 2025 global data generation rate, it would take us 5.5 times 10 to the 43 years to generate this amount of information. That is so far in the future, it's not just our star that would be dead. Basically, every star would be dead, and the universe would be in its black hole era. That's the actual scientific name, I swear. Now, using black holes to store information might sound like a fun what-if thought experiment, and to some extent it is, but the idea holds more water than you'd expect. One researcher, Gia Diwali, has proposed a theoretical artificial neural network that can store information using gravity, just like black holes. Specifically, in this neural network, artificial synapses communicate through gravity rather than chemical or electrical signals. With this method, the neural network could achieve a similar style of information packing as a black hole without actually being a black hole, which personally I'd still turn down, even if it would help me remember literally anything. My brain is Swiss cheese.